This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
We're going to start. People always turn up late in London, but we're going to start too because I know some of you have to get away. My name's Catherine Davis. I'm the director of the Institute of Modern Languages Research, which used to be the Institute of Germanic Studies and Institute of Romance Studies, and then merged Institute of Germanic and Romance Studies, and is now the Institute of Modern Language Research. So our institute hosts the Research Centre for Germanic and Austrian Exile Studies, and that's carried forward by Charmian Brinson, who's here, and Tony Grenville and Richard Dove, so thank you very much. And the Exile Centre and lots of other activities in the institute. Is this echoing for you?
Yeah. It's all right.
Is it all right? Depend to a great extent on our trusts, and the trusts that have been particularly helpful for the institute and for the whole furtherance of Germanic studies after the war in this country is the Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert-Miller Trust. They were two very famous actors who came to Britain to escape Nazi Germany, and they took refuge in 1939 and went on to very brilliant careers in the theatre and film and on the radio. So their son Daniel Miller is here with us today, and thank you very much, Daniel, for coming. Apparently Martin Miller's parodies of Hitler's speech were broadcast to Germany between 1940 and 1942, so we will have some of those in our archive because we have the Miller archive in the library here, and we have Claire George, who's the archivist who's looking after them. So Daniel himself has got a very interesting career. Daniel's a music producer and a founder of Mute Records, which is new wave, alternative music, synth pop, punk and Depeche Mode. So it's good to see that there's modern developments, but he's also obviously, like many of the exiles in Britain, a self-made man. And this then leads me to introduce our guest this evening. I am really, really pleased that Dame Stephanie, Steve, Shirley has accepted to come today. This is a great honour for us, and thank you very much. Dame Stephanie is an amazing woman. She is a Dame Commander of British Empire, a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a Fellow of the British Computer Society, and she has other honours, which I will mention in a moment. She was born in Dortmund in Germany in 1933. You'd never know it. Oh, really? No. And she came to Britain as an unaccompanied child refugee on the Kindertransport. She was brought up with foster parents, although her parents did survive the war. And then in 1962 she had a brilliant idea. I wish I had such brilliant ideas. She had a brilliant idea of founding a software company, the FI Group, which was later called Shansa and has been developed since, which created work for women who had dependents. And she tried to keep her workforce entirely female until the Inequality Act in the 1970s told her that she had to employ some men. So she says in her entry in the Wikipedia that it was because of this amazing idea, it was during this time that she became wealthy. So she retired at the age of 60 in 1993, and she spent the last 20 years giving her wealth away. She founded the Shirley Foundation in 1986 to support strategic projects in autism. She's done lots of other philanthropic work as well, but this was the main foundation, as her son was autistic. And she has funded and supported medical research into autism through the Shirley Foundation, and also the infrastructure, which is so important in these things. Not very glamorous, but it's absolutely essential to get the infrastructure right. And she was on Desert Island Discs in May 2010, so I'm going to listen to that. She was given the Freedom of the City of London, 1987. She's President of the British Computer Society, the Mountbatten Medal. She's received honours from 24 English universities and the 4 Scottish ones. And in 2013, a couple of years ago, she was judged one of the 100 most powerful women in the UK by my favourite programme, BBC Radio 4's Woman's Hour. So, on that note, I say no more, or I'll steal the lecture. I hand over to Dame Stephanie.
Professor Davis, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to present this third Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert-Miller Memorial Lecture, and it is very exciting that the son is here today. I shall tell the personal stories of my Jewish father, Gentile mother, and my sister and I, offensively called crossbreeds, who all came to Britain as exiles in 1939. I shall speak from what I remember and what I've been told by my immediate family, and a bit about what things I've read. As you've heard, we started off in Dortmund as a very respectable family. The 4 of us lived in a nice townhouse in a fashionable part of the city, and my sister Renate went to school together with the children of other prosperous bourgeois families. We never know what life holds for us. If all had gone according to plan, I would have remained in that comfortable world indefinitely. My German father, Arnold Buchtal, was a young judge, a brilliant but rather distant man, with a single-minded devotion to principle that was slightly unworthy. I have a vivid early memory of going for a family walk in one of Dortmund's famous parks and stamping, for some reason, on a beetle. My father exploded with absolute fury. "How would you like it if a great big foot came down and squashed you?" he shouted. It was an extraordinary range, really, to direct at a mere toddler. But he did get his point through to me, and my ethical compass certainly stems from my father. I think he imagined that his incorruptibility would enable him to fight the evils of Nazism. But by the time I was born in 1933, doors were starting to be closed in his face, partly because of his Jewish ethnicity, and partly because of his open contempt for National Socialism. Again and again we were forced to move from city to city, and eventually from country to country, in search of work and security. We eventually settled in Vienna, and for a while my father had some work there. Renate remembered seeing Hitler marching into the city in March 1938. By my 5th birthday, a few weeks before Kristallnacht, the writing was on the wall for anyone who dared to read it. Jewish families who stayed in Central Europe faced catastrophe. One of my clearest recollections of Vienna is of walking with my mother to fetch my sister from school. I particularly remember part of the route going along a huge stone wall, and I discovered 2 things about this memory when I revisited the city a few years after the war. First, the wall wasn't huge at all, it was I who'd been small. More importantly, there was a reason why we always went to collect her. It was because, even as a child, Renate was beginning to suffer from anti-Semitism. She was lucky enough to have a kind teacher who used to let her out early so that she could get home with an escort without having "dirty Jew" shouted or stones thrown at her by her fellow pupils. It was my father who first faced up to the unthinkable reality that the once solid social framework in which our lives had been built had collapsed, leaving a choice between escape and eventual extinction, because it was to be a descent into barbarism. It was 1939 by then. Borders were starting to be closed. When my parents heard about the Kindertransport, they made the desperate decision that my sister and I should be sent to England, into the arms of strangers, in order to save our lives. The Kindertransport trains had been running for about 6 months by then, but it was not a simple matter. Forms had to be filled in, documents stamped, permits queued for at apparently deliberately inconvenient times, guarantees provided. And we spent several weeks in a children's home so that my mother could devote herself full time to grappling with the obstacles of Nazi and, in fact, British bureaucracy. No limit to the permitted number of children to be rescued was ever publicly announced. Britain capped its number at 10,000. While some children had to go into hostels, the refugee children's movement had found Renate and me foster parents in England who were prepared to guarantee, with getting on for 5,000 in today's currency, that the two of us would not be a burden on the state. Thank you, Guy and Ruby Smith. We call them Uncle and Auntie. Uncle had been apprenticed to an engineering firm and by the time we arrived was its managing director. He served also as an air raid warden. A lovely man. We were lucky in both him and in Ruby. Auntie had been moved by our picture in the local paper saying effectively, two well-brought-up children seeking a home. They nurtured us as they would their own children, and certainly I am their child in nearly all but birth. Everyone told me to be grateful. Indeed, I am grateful. But I also loved them dearly, cared for them in their old age, and honour their memories, as I do all the uncles and aunties who helped us children through those dreadful times. The fact that people I did not know saved us in doing what giving people do made a deep impression. Renate and I left Vienna 8 weeks before the outbreak of war. A few weeks earlier, my father had, like the von Trapp family in The Sound of Music, he'd escaped on foot over the mountains to neutral Switzerland. The Gestapo had already visited our house, and he must have realised that he was in imminent danger of arrest. But I think he may also have thought that, with him gone, my mother, who would be freed from that handicap of having a Jewish husband. If so, it was a good strategy. Unlike most of the parents who sent their children away on the Kindertransport, ours survived, though sadly we never bonded with them again. As an adult, on more than one occasion, I have given my year of birth as 1939, an entirely subconscious mistake with an obvious explanation. And similarly, Freudian slips abound. When I was in my 20s, my landlady said a letter had come, and did I know anyone called Buchtal? Nor even though she pronounced my childhood name correctly, I was up 2 flights of stairs before realising, oh, that's me. Moving now to Gretel, my Austrian mother. She was the younger daughter of an established Gentile family who had educated her to be a middle-class wife. She had had high hopes for her life. Pretty, clever and well-educated, she'd married well. My father was not only brilliant and handsome when she met him, but cultured and well-connected, with a circle of sophisticated friends and dazzling career prospects. I think she entertained the visions of being a lady of leisure, hosting a glittering salon in which clever people played music and discussed philosophy. Instead, she had found herself uprooted and persecuted with a husband whose prospects diminished by the day. Although my father wrote in 1940 that he feared my mother was lost, a euphemism used in front of children, she also managed her own desperate escape to England by train. She was more inclined than my father to fit in and to avoid drawing attention to herself, and sometimes even worn a swastika. Nevertheless, she had no intention of staying behind without her family, and she bribed her way across Europe at one vital stage with the Persian lamb coat that she was wearing. What happened to her when she finally got to England? Penniless and homeless 4 days before war was declared, the regulations were such that she was only allowed to work in agriculture or domestic service, and she chose the latter, clean somebody else's nice house, before moving after some years to be resident cook in a hostel for 40 schoolgirls. Post-war, she did what was called emergency teacher training, a 10-month concentrated course, and then taught in secondary schools geography and needlework, but not, significantly, German. In 1951, she and I went through the naturalization process together. When the interviewer asked her for her views on the 1948 partition of Israel, she paused before replying, "I think Britain behaved disgracefully. But this has always been a country of free speech, and we were granted citizenship. I was registered as a British minor, and it was my mother who took the oath of allegiance in front of a JP. I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King George VI, his heirs and successors, according to law." To further ease our integration, we took the opportunity to anglicise our name and chose Brooke to honour that most English of poets, Rupert Brooke. I found that name change empowering. One summer we went to Vienna together, partly for her to search for family and friends, partly for us to dig up the silver which had been buried for safety. We made a grim train journey across Europe, weighed down with baggage and expectation, before finally emerging in the glorious city from which we'd escaped 20 years earlier. I was accosted kindly by a couple who asked, "Excuse us, are you from the camps?" Vienna had not seen a face like mine for some time. I looked around at its gracious avenues, ancient walks, grand palaces, elegant squares. And while previously I had wept when hearing Viennese music, I realised in an instant that, lovely as it all was, the city meant nothing to me, and felt the weight of my past vanish from my shoulders. Later, my mother bought a little terrace house in a London suburb and equipped it with second-hand bits and pieces and utility furniture acquired via a governmental coupon system for the needy. She paid the mortgage by taking lodgers, having borrowed the deposit. By the end of her life, in a modest way, she was again materially comfortable. "The first time since early in my marriage," she said. But still she lived frugally. and from 1961 on, she volunteered for the human rights charity Amnesty International. Was my mother happy? I remember her inconsolable tears when one of her few items from the past got broken. Her will asked us to scatter her ashes in the Vienna woods, which says a lot about how she felt about her long exile. My main memory of that filial visit is of my sister's preoccupation with evaluating the likely roles of people we saw in the streets who would have been adults in the 1930s. What were you doing when they were throwing stones at me? Going back to my father, he finished the war wearing a British Army uniform, which he'd acquired after a circuitous and painful journey. As an adult male German refugee, he'd been briefly interned before being deported in July 1940 to Australia. He went from Liverpool on the transport ship Dunera, along with around 2,000 other German Jewish refugees and more than 400 German and Italian prisoners of war. The Dunera was torpedoed twice. The first hit but didn't explode. The second apparently went under the ship as she rose in a high sea. They were guarded by soldiers on light duty, being shell-shocked from Dunkirk. Today we'd say that they suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. In any event, they ran amok, locked the internees below deck for most of the 58-day voyage to Sydney, stole their valuables and threw their suitcases overboard. The condition on the grossly overcrowded voyage was so appalling that, to Britain's everlasting credit, Parliament found time in the midst of the war to debate the scandal. Those deportees who survived the journey, 2 died and more than 50 were hospitalised, then travelled to an internment camp in Hay, New South Wales, so in the middle of an inhospitable nowhere that the high security fence was almost unnecessary. The largely middle-class inmates made the best of their plight, printing their own money, creating their own system of law and order. My father served again as a judge, and developing not merely a cafe society, but also an unofficial university with remarkable educational and cultural programs, concerts and much else. My father also told me of an ironic motto or song: "We're here because we're here because we're here." In May 1941, partly as the result of the outcry in Britain as families heard, despite all mail being censored, about the iniquity of their treatment, a substantial number of internees were released to join the Pioneer Corps. My father was among them. His release papers formally record his personal effects as nil. And at some point he found himself again in the UK, barracked in Bicester. The Pioneer Corps was a relatively new auxiliary force dubbed the King's Most Loyal Enemy Aliens, which provided backup work for the conventional armed services. He started off digging ditches and such like, and he was later transferred to head up that part of what is now the Mid Wales Hospital in Talgarth, which was used to treat several hundred mentally ill prisoners of war. He used a pseudonym so that the German patients would not know his original nationality. And some VIP visitors were apparently surprised to meet a lowly staff sergeant in such a responsible role. But apparently that was the highest rank permitted to a non-Brit. Hitler had taken nationality away from Jewish families, so we had all arrived stateless, but received some modicum of paperwork from Britain formally acknowledged acknowledging that we were displaced persons registered here. How glad I was later to get my British passport with the reassurance that His Britannic Majesty's Secretary of State requests and requires in the name of His Majesty all those whom it may concern to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance, and to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary. Back then, though, we had been progressed from being enemy aliens to being friendly aliens. Any time one of us moved, even for an overnight visit, we had to report in advance to our local police station and then register at the new police station on arrival. On the other hand, children were at least spared the curfew to which adults were subject. So adults had to hurry home at sundown, while we children carried on playing. To a certain extent, we exiles were subsumed into evacuees. Starting August 1939, the 3 million people, mainly children, evacuated into safety from areas in danger of bombing or of invasion from the sea. My image of wartime Britain is of a quiet country where even outsiders like me could be confident that those in authority would generally do their best to do the right thing by us. A couple of times we received food parcels from America, dried and tinned goods in the main. The International Red Cross also operated a valuable message service that, in 25 words, got some family greetings through to us. My messages are now in the Red Cross Museum. My Jewish star and other of my things dating from that time are in the Holocaust museums of Nottingham and London. Ruth, the Katie Cruz doll who travelled with me on that fateful 2.5-day journey from Vienna to London, Ruth is safely in the Viennese Museum of Childhood. After the war, my parents were free, in theory, to return to the homeland from which they'd been driven 6 years earlier. My father was desperate to rebuild his life in Germany. His legal career could not be revived anywhere else. And to move permanently to England would mean giving up the career dreams that defined him. My mother saw it differently. She had had a world in Germany, a world of comfort, status and material security, and bit by bit it had been stolen from her. Perhaps some of her very identity had been stolen with it. And having escaped with her life and little else, it was unthinkable that her husband should do anything but build a new life from scratch in England, just as she had done. And the outcome was to modernise. Predictable. They divorced, and my father returned to Germany more or less immediately. Shortly before the German surrender, he had managed to leave the Pioneer Corps, collect his demob suit, and transfer into the American Army, which needed educated German speakers to help with the post-war administration of what remained of the country. This was his third uniform that he had worn, because at age 19 he'd also briefly been in the German army. But luckily armistice had been declared then before he saw active service. My visits to him made a deep impression. Germany had entirely broken down. In contrast to the orderly societies of Britain, couldn't have been stronger or more nightmarish. There was no money, no gas, no electricity or clean water. The only semblance of civil structure was the crude military authority of the occupying Allies. People were living in the cellars of ruined buildings, bartering sex for food to survive, and using cigarettes as currency. Black marketeer, white slaver, There was no warmth in anyone's faces, and most were just blank from hunger and fear. We had lived through 6 years of the most devastating war in human history, but this was our first glimpse of its utter dehumanizing horror and destruction. My father started as a researcher, but from his point of view, it was a step back into the world he understood, especially when mechanisms began to be set up for putting Nazi war criminals on trial. We sat in on a few sessions of the Nuremberg Trial that my father was working on, the famous Justice Trial, in which 16 senior lawyers and officials of the Nazi Ministry of Justice were charged with crimes against humanity. Most of the proceedings went over my 14-year-old head, but I could understand what was at stake. These had been some of the most senior figures in the German legal system, pillars of German society, and they were accused of murder, persecution on political, racial and religious grounds, deportation and enslavement, plunder of private property and torture. All denied the charges. 10 were ultimately found guilty, and every possible legal nicety was involved to keep justice at bay. At one point, my father was called to give expert evidence on the precise linguistic nuances of the phrase Polish subhumanity and its use in German legal circles in the 1930s. Germany made impressive efforts to come to terms with its Nazi past. The United Restitution Organisation had lawyers dealing with reparation, compensation for stolen property, so much for a lost parent, so much for, in my case, lost educational opportunities. And I started off going through that process, only to realise yet again that I'd been lucky, very lucky, and didn't actually want Germany's financial help. So, as an adult who was no longer a victim, I stopped the process. My sister, being older and wiser, had never started it. Austria also has my admiration for, in 1955, re-establishing itself as a sovereign state and declaring itself permanently neutral, though the definition of neutral has since somewhat changed. Let me now focus on the shared Kindertransport experience of we two sisters. Me at age 5, clutching the hand of my 9-year-old sister. It's hard, after all these years, to be certain of how many of the remembered details of the journey are real and how much I've added to my mental picture from other sources. Was the July weather outside really grey? Or have I just seen too many black and white photographs of the Kindertransport? I've read that some of the trains were sealed. But surely one boy in our carriage kept getting off to be sick during the train's many unscheduled stops. Or was that just a dream? I'm pretty certain that we children slept on the floor as well as on the long wooden benches that lined the sides of the carriages. There were some large strips of corrugated cardboard that we used to sleep on. I believe that at some point in the train journeys, children also slept in the overhead luggage racks. I presume that I slept too. I can't remember doing so. I think my mother had given us food for the journey, but again, I may be wrong. I remember the occasional frightening interruptions from uniformed guards. I recall vividly the cold, oily smell of the sea, an entirely new experience, when we eventually reached the Channel at the Hook of Holland, and vaguely remember the nauseous night crossing to Harwich. I doubt if there's much wrong with my impression that there was scarcely a moment in all those 2.5 days of travelling when our miseries were not exacerbated by the jarring sound of other children crying amidst the confusion. But what about my sense that when we finally arrived by train at Liverpool Street Station, the platform was silent? It seemed somehow implausible. And perhaps I have merely projected the numbness of my emotion onto the past. Nonetheless, that is how my mind has preserved it. We spilled out onto the platform, speechless and wide-eyed, as if in a dream. We had numbered labels round our necks, as if we were lost property. Perhaps in a sense we were. Renate also had an expensive Leica camera slung around her person, to be later sold, of course, because she was permitted to bring out a camera, but not any money. We waited to be claimed, sitting on straw-filled palliasses in a cavernous hall long since demolished. The Kindertransport organised its trains from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland and the Free City of Danzig. Each train had about 1,000 children, aged 5 to 16, some rather small 17-year-olds also snuck in, with just 2 adults. There were also some girls, aged 16 plus, caring for babies. Of course, I did not know at the time that they had volunteered to travel under a concession dependent on their return to what they must have known was certain death. I like always to honour the sheer heroism of those young people. Let me also thank the Christian and Jewish activists who set up the Kindertransport, the Quaker Society of Friends who kept it going when it ran out of money, and the many volunteers who administered that largest ever recorded migration of children. There's a commemorative plaque erected in 1999 in the House of Commons, basically thanking Britain for taking us in. In deep gratitude to the people and Parliament of the United Kingdom for saving the lives of 10,000 Jewish and other children who fled to this country from Nazi persecution on the Kindertransport 1938 to 1939. There were 2 Kindertransport memorial statues at Liverpool Street Station, the larger one by Frank Meisler, who was himself one of those saved. The 2006 plaque dedicated by the Association of Jewish Refugees reads similarly and also quotes the sacred Talmud. Whoever rescues a single soul is credited as though they had saved the whole world. In 2011, a Kindertransport memorial bench was installed in Harwich, located to face the shipping lane in the North Sea. And this is from where we first saw this green and pleasant land. My father had taught us some useful phrases. Slow combustion stove. And thine screen viper. But don't, excuse me, how to ask to go to the bathroom. Of course, pain allows you to grow. But many exiles suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, or depression, or both. Some exiles' psychological scars are so deep as to be transmitted to their children. My own exile brought problems of identity, which took 6 years of analysis at the renowned Tavistock Clinic to overcome. The number of the dead is not the sole measure of the Jewish tragedy. There's the vast unhappiness which engulfed so many of us who escaped. We carry the desperate and self-destructive guilt of being a survivor. Survivor guilt seems so counterintuitive. Surely we should be happy to be alive when so many died. if the depression that follows survivor guilt has any lesson, it is compassion, and helping others is one of the best treatments for it. And so it was to prove for me. 50 years ago, I am now ashamed to have written in a collective autobiography of refugees. I vow that nothing will get me to return to Germany again. This hate, and hate it is bound up with a tremendous feeling of guilt, both in taking the atrocities as if they were my own, and inversely for having got away so lightly. And these very complex feelings ruined my adolescence, painfully prolonged into my 20s. I wrote that. For decades I'd avoided setting foot on German soil. And then, as I matured, realised it was precisely for people like me to reach out. And I briefly joined the British-German Association in order to help foster healthy links. My terrors had been deep-rooted. Immediately post-war, I saw some of those public information films about Auschwitz, and I fainted. Whether it was the thought that I could so easily have been among those victims, or from some other form of survivor guilt, or just simple empathetic horror at the suffering of all those human beings, I don't know. It was just more than I could bear. It still is. Even now I get panic attacks and nightmares after seeing pictures or footage of the concentration camps, and have to be careful about when and how I allow myself to dwell upon such subjects. Years later still, at a time when the National Front was enjoying a brief spell of headline-making popularity, I was driving along a familiar country lane and noticed that a huge swastika had been painted on the outside wall of a remote farmyard. My first reaction was a horrified panic as old fears were reawakened. My next was to take control of the situation. I found the farmer, told him how offensive the symbol was. He shrugged and said it was nothing to do with him. So I visited the local police station, where they, in turn, shrugged and said it was nothing to do with them either. Finally, having toyed with the alternative, either embarking on a lengthy correspondence with the relative department of the local council or letting the whole thing lie, I realised that there was only one thing for it. I bought a large tin of paint, got up at 4 o'clock the next morning and simply painted over the offending symbol. We exiles tried hard to fit in. So many things were different. The plumbing. How cold the winter was without central heating. Not duvets, but eiderdowns. And they were not dear children to hung out of the window to air. The Brits put milk in their tea. Eat fish paste sandwiches and other strange foods. Use saucepans rather than cooking pots. Write their sevens differently. Even knit differently. Renate kept to the German way. I knit like a true-born Englishwoman. Appearance was another disparity. Not racial, but clothes, which Hitler had allowed us to bring out. Mine came in 4 sizes, for me and for me to grow into, and for Renate and for her to grow into. And even though we were not always living together, there were still 4 very Germanic winter coats of green tweed with grey fur collars that I had to grow my way through. Then there was language. Some exiles became bilingual. Yes, they spoke English, but reverted to German when among other émigrés. My sister retained her German, though later, when I complimented her, she pointed out that her fluency was with the vocabulary of a 9-year-old. Others retained their Germanic accents, or intonation, or word order, or continued to confuse thank you with no thank you. People must have thought I was starving when I declined another helping of food with a polite thank you, for they continued to pile my plate high. I deliberately forgot my German, and indeed those of us who'd arrived at age less than 10 speak only English with a variety of accents, Scottish, Welsh, Yorkshire, Brummie, as well as standard English. Let me concentrate a bit on my sister. She never settled as well as I did and remained an exile in spirit. As an adult, she declined several Home Office invitations to apply for British citizenship until its final letter suggested that if she did not wish to become British, then, by implication, she should go back to where she came from. And this she certainly did not wish to do. She upped sticks and migrated to Australia on a £10 assisted passage, then after only 6 months applied for Australian citizenship. I've often thought about this. She didn't choose to come to Britain. The exile was done to us children. And as an adult, she too had ceased to be a victim and could make things happen rather than have things happen to her. She chose Australia and, having requalified, contributed significantly to Australian childcare practices, supplementing the trauma of her own childhood by helping children, including many of the boat children, into foster and adoptive homes. Married to an Australian, she adopted a baby girl and fostered 2 brothers, just as we 2 sisters had been fostered a generation back. As for me, I also followed the family tradition of public service and then started my own business to circumvent the gender issues of the time. And thus my childhood trauma was transformed into entrepreneurship. Wealth was never a motivator, though I never, ever want to be poor again. I studied for 6 years at evening classes with some day relief for my London University honours degree and have been much recognised by other universities. I shall quickly skip over the 31 years set up managing and promoting the IT company I founded in 1962, one of the first such startups. It's scarcely necessary to refer to the stereotypical Jew. The Jew in business. But I'm proud to have provided employment and wealth for so many of my staff, 70 of whom eventually became millionaires. People laughed at the idea of a software house to begin with. Software used to be given away free with the hardware. And they laughed even more at my crusade for women, who at that time were not expected to be active outside the traditional children, kitchen and church. But I wanted opportunities for women. I recruited professionally qualified women who had, as it was then the norm, left the computer industry to marry or have children, and structured them into a home working organisation. And we pioneered the concept of returning to the workforce after a career break for women. We pioneered a whole lot of new work methods, all kinds of flexible working, job shares, then profit sharing, and later co-ownership, when I got a quarter of the shares into the hands of the staff at no cost to anyone but me. For years, I was the first woman this, the only woman that. I used my nickname, Steve, in my business development letters, so as to get through the door before anyone realised that he was a she. The Refugee Council held an exhibition in May 2014 celebrating the impact that refugees have made to the life of the nation. So what has this sole survivor of my family in exile contributed? I was a late pioneer of computing and a pathfinder in the professionalism of women, an entrepreneur in the early 60s, sharing ownership with the staff. When the company was acquired after 45 years, it was a public company employing over 8,000 people, and I'm a strategic giver away of my wealth. Surprisingly, perhaps, I scarcely support today's refugees. But it's more strategic to speak about the three things which have driven my life, each the result of my exile in 1939. First, I learned to deal with change, indeed eventually to welcome it. Secondly, I determined early in my life to make it one that was worthy of being saved. And finally, my love for this country, one of the very few that would let us in, is with a passion perhaps only someone who has lost their human rights can feel. After 75 years, ladies and gentlemen, I no longer relate to my family's exile, and this is now my home sweet home. Thank you very much.